Every year, and usually during the fall semester, the Baha'i Chair holds its annual lecture. The purpose of the annual lecture is to invite a distinguished speaker whose research and work addresses problems and provides solutions to the major challenge humanity faces, the inability to create a peaceful world. The Baha'i Chair promotes a vision for peace through an intensive program focused on 5 central themes: structural racism and the root causes of prejudice, empowerment of women and peace, challenges of global governance and leadership, overcoming the challenges of environment and climate change, and understanding human nature. In pursuing a better understanding of these 5 themes, we are not interested in mere opinions, but rather we pursue the best ideas and practices that help us to imagine a new world. Toward this end, the Baha'i Chair aims to promote knowledge about human values in combination with scientific inquiry and knowledge and facts to help us remove the outdated and unjust systems that lead to conflict and contention, promote bias and hatred, and obstruct the peace, well-being, and security of humankind. We are clear-minded in our singular goal to expand the role of education through the development of moral and spiritual life. We believe this is the first step in organizing for peace. We believe that a radically different path must be forged if we are to preserve what is left of our civilization. Tonight's lecture, Breaking the Spell of High Conflict, could not be more timely. Indeed, it comes at a critical moment. We hear often the many calls to improve the world, including from the Baha'i Chair. There have always been difficult challenges to address in our complex world, and we will always need expertise, moral will, and civic imagination to effectively address these challenges. But there are times when the world finds itself in such a place that mere improvement is not sufficient, where the old system is no longer able to solve the critical issues facing all of us, facing humanity. We believe that now is such a moment of trouble within and without, local troubles, national troubles, international troubles. But in all times, there are glimpses of better, surer ways for us to do the hard and long work of coming together to build a new world and new approaches. Our approach is to search for alternatives to a culture that promotes division and hate, conflict and war. Scholars like Ms. Ripley provide empirical support to our most urgent and telling needs. Ms. Ripley's research reminds us that in order for our world to be rebuilt, the shackles of prejudice, conflict, and violence must be removed. In our current moment of outrage and malaise, fear and controversy, her scholarship tells us that the crises that we are experiencing today do indeed have a solution. Amanda Ripley is a New York Times best-selling author and an investigative journalist who writes about human behavior and change for The Atlantic, The Washington Post, and other outlets. She is the author of High Conflict, Why We Get Trapped and How We Get Out. Her books are in the back on the table. Another book, The Smartest Kids in the World, and How They Got That Way. And The Unthinkable, Who Survives When Disaster Strikes and Why. And she is the host of the Slate podcast, How To. Ms. Ripley's recent Atlantic stories include a piece about the movement to fix TV news. That's a good one. And another about the least politically prejudiced town in America. She's also been investigating what journalists can do to revive curiosity in a time of outrage in cooperation with the Solution Journalism Network. Earlier in her career, she spent a decade writing about human behavior for Time magazine in New York, Washington, and Paris. Her work also appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Slate, Politico, The Guardian, and the Times of London. Her stories helped Time win 2 national magazine awards. Please welcome Ms. Amanda Ripley. She will speak to us about breaking the spell of high conflict. It's a pleasure to have you.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Hello? Yes, okay. So let me start us off. First of all, thank you. Very helpful. I mean, you gave us some actual practical steps of how we can bring ourselves to account so that we don't create high conflict. But I was wondering, in your book, you talk about the conflict industrial complex. And what is it, and who is involved in this system? Could you tell us more about that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a way in which conflict becomes a cottage industry, right? I mean, my own profession, journalism, is guilty of this. Social media, politics, all of these things benefit in some way from the conflict. I remember being at some kind of cocktail party, I think it was a book party, in right before, let's see, I think it was right before 2016, the 2016 election. And a national newspaper editor actually said to me, yeah, we're kind of worried because I'm assuming Trump's going to lose, and then our numbers are just going to drop. And I couldn't believe he said it, you know, like out loud. But that is a real thing. When you have an attention economy, the easiest, cheapest, laziest way to get attention is through making people frightened and angry. So I actually think, and I could be naive, I actually think people are getting tired of that. That we now know that 4 out of 10 Americans are actively avoiding the news, sometimes or always, because it makes them feel so helpless and upset. And they know they're being manipulated on some level, right? But this is not the full story. So I think some of the most innovative local newsrooms in the country, and there aren't that many, but there are some, are trying to do something very different, and it's working. So, yeah.
Thank you. First of all, reminder that you should write your questions on the note cards, please, and people will gather them. So, continuing on that, I was wondering, how do we get our news these days? I mean, where should we go? What are some suggestions?
Well, I'll tell you what I do. I can do that. I don't have all the answers for sure, but I used to wake up and read 3 newspapers and listen to NPR and watch sometimes. I had a TV in my office. I mean, I was like all in on the news. It was part of my job, I thought. I had to do it. And here's the thing, I actually enjoyed it. Like, I would read the newspaper and feel more curious about the world, not less. And then somewhere along the line, that changed, where the more news I read, the less curious I felt. And I don't know if I changed or the news changed. I think it was probably both, you know. But at some point, I found that I had to stop reading that much news in the morning and shift it to late in the afternoon when I'd already kind of lost all hope, like it was fine at that point. And then as my job changed and I started writing more longer magazine stories and books, I didn't need to be constantly informed on every twist and turn. And so I would try to like dose the news almost like a narcotic, right? Like just a drop here, drop there, but it's really hard to do now, right? Because it comes at you. It's like around every corner, you know? It's like fentanyl. Like you just need 1 grain of it and it'll ruin like your day. So it's really hard to control it in the way that you once could. It's in your Instagram feed, it's in your newsletters, it's all around. So eventually I had to shift also what news sources. I used to cover disasters and terrorism, so I learned a long time ago that there was just a ton of research out there about how TV news is bad for your health. This is really bad for your health. And there was a study of children watching footage of after 9/11, and the more footage they watched, the more at risk they were for PTSD separate and apart from whether they knew someone who died in the terrorist attacks. Because when you see that kind of footage, your brain, and we just didn't evolve to metabolize horrible, visual, emotional news. Like, that's just not something that mammals can do. So I already wasn't watching TV news. And then I shifted to forcing myself to read the headlines that were actually surprising and positive, as well as the ones that were frightening. It was funny how I would read the headline and it would be something vaguely positive, and I'd be like, oh, that's good. And then I'd move to the next, I'd catch myself, because you have a bias for negativity. So I'd do that. And then I would also share each time I found a story that was hopeful, I would share it. And I don't mean, by the way, I don't mean a story about like a dog that got lost and then was found, although there's nothing wrong with that. I mean like a rigorously reported news story about a community trying to solve a problem, right? And maybe it doesn't 100% work, maybe it does. But I'll give you an example. The New York Times did a great story a year ago about how Houston got 20,000 people into homes who had been unhoused. Remarkable, right? And you ask yourself, why isn't every news outlet in every other city asking their mayor, why haven't you done this, right? So that's one thing I've done, is shift the sources. And actually, the last thing I'll say is the Christian Science Monitor, which I had never really read. I thought it was religious. It's really not. It's complicated. Anyway, that's a really good news outlet where you just, even though it's like can be about really hard things, you feel on some level like they're rooting for humanity.
Yes. Yes, that's good. Thank you. I'll ask this last question, and then we'll go to the cards. Is there an etiquette that can diminish high conflict?
Well, that's interesting. You mean sort of like mismanners for,
Exactly. Is there such
Yeah, that's what we're missing, right? Yeah, it's funny. I just ran into Chris Bale, who runs the Polarization Lab at Duke, just did this really cool study where they used basically a version of ChatGPT to help people choose, like if they wanted to make an argument over Twitter, they could choose one of 3 ways to say the same thing that are more designed to be how humans actually work. So using etiquette, essentially, like just tweaking them slightly. And the cool thing is that people were pretty good at choosing ones that would work better. And that when they did, they actually became less prejudiced. Not just the people receiving them, but the people sending them. Anyway, it's a new study that's worth checking out.
Yes, very good. Okay, so now let's, are you going to read out the questions? Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So the first question comes from the audience, and it is, how has your work impacted how you approach personal conflict?
Oh, I love this question. It totally transformed it on a good day. So we'll pretend every day is a good day. The biggest thing I've done is, it sounds really small, but it's huge to me. And I started a company with a fellow journalist called Good Conflict, and we've trained over 1,000 journalists on this technique. But it's a technique called looping, which is from the Center for Understanding and Conflict. Gary Friedman trained us, and there are other forms of this, like has everyone ever gotten active listening training or deep listening, tactical listening? There's different kinds. They each have their place. This particular one, you listen to what the other person's telling you, and you listen for what seems most important to them, not to me, and then you distill it into the most elegant language you can come up with. So you don't robotically parrot it back to them, but you try to add something, like use your own language and make it sharper, and then you play it back to them. And then this is the step that I use to forget the most often, but really is important, is I say, did I get that right? Like I check for understanding. And if you do it authentically and honestly, what you find is everything changes. Like the person will either correct you or add on to what they said, and then you do the loop again, or they will say, exactly. I've now done this in 3 countries, and it's always the same word in different languages. Exactly. So that's when you know you got it. And it becomes like a game, like a fun challenge. Who's working on gamifying peace? Like, yes, so you understand. It becomes like, I'm like, okay, let me see if I can get this. I want to get to exactly. And it sometimes takes a while because you have all these assumptions in your head, you know, or maybe they didn't say it just right, or maybe you didn't listen, you know. So that has been huge for me, and the best place to practice it is with your roommates, your friends, your Uber drivers, your kids. If you have kids at home, that's a great place because they're constantly bringing you conflict, right? And it's like, but it's like low stakes usually, so it's a good place to practice. What you don't want to do is bust it out in a real intense hot conflict for the first time. Like that is not a good plan because under stress, it's really hard to do something new. So you want to get it to automatic, to like muscle memory level, and then you can do it under stress. And it really helps slow down the conflict. And once people feel like you kind of you're understanding them, they can let go of a lot. Yeah.
Very helpful. Next question, please.
So we have a question from the audience online, and it follows on from what you were saying there. Are there developmentally different ages or stages where it's good to develop the capacity to manage conflict? So with children, for example, and can you talk about, and talking to them about the dangers of high conflict? So are there ages where that would be an appropriate time to start?
Oh, that's such an interesting question. I wonder if there are any teachers here who would have thoughts on that. I feel like, you know, learning to regulate emotion is like a core competency, right? That I don't know, it feels like you can't start too soon. But I would also say, look, I actually think most kids are pretty good at this compared to a lot of adults I've seen lately. I mean, if you think about like any kindergarten classroom, there are rules and etiquette around conflict. And it doesn't always work, but that's okay, right? They're guardrails. You know, I did a story a little while ago about a congressional committee that just got a ton of stuff done, even though it was half Republican, half Democrat. And it was like this mystery, like, how did they do it? And it turns out they did these radical things that literally no one else in Congress does, which is, wait for it, in hearings they would sit Democrat, Republican, Democrat, Republican. They also had dinner together on a regular basis. That simply doesn't happen. There are no spaces, pretty much, where Democrats and Republicans routinely can gather where there's no camera present. So that is not how any kindergarten classroom would be run, right? Like that would not work, to divide everybody into separate wings based on some superficial difference, right? That's a bad idea. Anyway, where was I going with this? I can't remember. Oh, what age? Yeah, early, yes. Yes. I think teaching kids to loop or do some kind of listening like that would be super helpful.
Okay, thank you.
Great. And then another from the audience. So, and this is more focused on, I think, adults. Is there a simple personal formula for how we can know if we have engaged in collaborative, helpful, sharpening conflict or destructive, unhelpful conflict? So how do we recognize that?
Oh, interesting. I mean, I think we all have different like internal cues that something that the conflict is moving too quickly, is escalating too fast, right? For me, it's like, you know, heart pounding, a feeling of like compression in my chest. For other people, it might be a tightness in your shoulders. I mean, one thing I'd encourage you, if you don't already know, is to try to notice the next time you feel yourself really agitated beyond what is helpful to you, where you're gonna make mistakes, right? But then also, when I start to collapse things into really simple terms, you know, like it was, for me, really easy to do this in the pandemic. And it would like shift like week to week, you know. At first I was like, the teachers are amazing. The teachers are setting up, you know, Zoom learning, and it's just beautiful. And just, I love the teachers. And then when the schools didn't reopen and I had a kid in high school, I was like, the teachers are the problem, right? And like you just, again, lumping all these people together and looking for blame. And this is like, part of it is just I wasn't sitting with that sadness. Like I couldn't control it. And sometimes you just have to sit with it, which sucks, right? Like the loss and the sadness and the frustration. But that kind of patterns of blame and hostility are kind of a hallmark, right, of high conflict, which doesn't mean that, you know, no one ever should be held accountable. But blame is, usually a mask for vulnerability. And so I sometimes on my best days try to ask, what vulnerability am I protecting here,
That's really helpful. I think these are such important points that you're making in terms of it's sort of bringing ourselves to understand better our own ways of approaching this problem of any kind of conflict.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like, Hoda, you never get upset. Is that right? Like, do you ever get upset?
I'm not going to say. No.
But how do you know when you're kind of in that danger zone?
I think I begin to feel it. I feel agitated, as some of the things you mentioned. But I think it's really important, and I think one has to learn this through trial and error, that you have to sort of pause at moments like that and really think about what's happening and why. Right. Why am I feeling like this? And then trying to figure out what's the source of it, why am I so agitated and angry? I think you have to really, we have to put on the brake, if we, meaning me, myself, rather than wanting someone else to do something. I think that's one of the hardest parts.
It's really hard because those anthropological questions you're asking, like, why am I feeling this way? What is that?
Yes.
That requires like cognitive functioning that you
Yes.
can't access when you're really upset.
Exactly.
Like I had always heard when you're in an argument, if you get too upset, you should take a break, right? So for years, if my husband and I got into an argument, which is where I'm like at my worst. Like all my conflict training is challenged when I'm in an argument with my husband. He's much better at looping now than I am, which is embarrassing. So for years, I would be like, okay, I need a break. And I would walk around the block once, the whole time, like, mentally arguing my case in my head, like just making it sharper and more, like, relentless. And then I come back, and it didn't really help, right? So then John and Julie Gottman, have you guys ever heard of the Love Lab in Seattle, where they study marital conflict, and they can, like, predict if people are going to get divorced in, like, 90 seconds or something terrifying. But they said, actually, yeah, you need a break, but you need like at least 30 minutes, and you need your brain to do something else. So like listen to a podcast, watch a silly TV show, go on Instagram, whatever. Like you need to get out of that loop, not just marinate in it. And so for me, that was like, I should have known that, but I was like, oh my God, that's a revelation.
It's hard in that moment, though.
It's really hard. I think it's impossible.
It is, yes, yes. Next question, please. And then we'll take maybe a couple more after that.
Okay. So the next question is, have you found that a shared purpose overcomes high conflict or not?
Yeah, I mean, there's actually, and maybe this is what the person is referring to, there's a lot of research on, there's actually only one intervention that really has been proven again and again to reduce prejudice, for example, which is called contact theory. I don't know why it's a theory at this point, like it's proven, but basically it means like bringing people together under certain circumstances where they form a relationship and they can still disagree and they don't have to like each other, but it especially helps if they are doing something, right? If they are solving a shared problem. And this is where some of the bridge building work that we see around political and racial divides can sometimes fall short. Maybe it's like a one-off encounter, or there aren't enough, like, the conditions aren't met for it to be like on equal footing. But often they're not now trying to solve a shared problem. So for sure, we have to at least figure out what those shared problems are. What do we all care about? And this is what Curtis Toller, who's in the book, who's a former gang leader on the south side of Chicago, who now does amazing work preventing violence. He spends all his time trying to get gang members to figure out what they care about besides the conflict. And sometimes it's like they want to have one playground where their kids can go and be safe. And so then, great, that's a lot we can work with. That's a shared problem. So then we come together, we build the playground, we get the funding, and that's a safe space, right? So yeah, I think that's essential.
Next question.
Thank you. So this one is combining several questions because there was a nice overlap with some of the audience questions. So just bear with me while I mentally compose the sentences to combine them. So to begin with, how can you break deep-rooted cases of high conflict? So things like racial, religious, or national conflict. And what do you do in those cases where there is a clear aggressor or a conflict entrepreneur on one side and not on the other side? And how do we break those cycles of violence and retaliation? And then connected to that also, how do you deal with that situation where the two sides aren't in the same, or don't view reality in the same way? So how do you break those dichotomies, the us and the them?
Yeah, I have no idea what you're talking about. That doesn't sound familiar at all. Yes, no, I mean, most high conflicts, there is a power imbalance. And most high conflicts start with one side being more violent or more aggressive than the other side. Doesn't always stay that way, right? But that is kind of the way it usually goes. And one thing we know is that there are a lot of things that don't work, sadly, right? There are a lot of things that we wish worked, right? If we could just call someone out, if we could just shame them, if we could just ostracize them from the group. That works if they're in your group, right? If they're not in your group, so let's talk about political violence, because we know approaching an election, we're going to see more political violence before and after, unfortunately. All the signs are very clear. We know a lot about political violence, mostly because of funding from the US government in other conflict zones. So we know that that's what's happening here. We know it's going to increase, sadly. Well, what are the ways to reduce the odds of political violence? Well, one way that's been proven in the research is for leaders to publicly condemn violence before, during, and after it happens, but only if the violence is perpetrated by their group. Condemning the violence of the other group has no effect and sometimes can actually backfire, right? Which is super annoying, you know? Because it's your own group that's hardest to criticize and call out, that you're least likely to do that. So the more people you can do that with, you know, there's safety in numbers. If you can come out with a group of people, which is what I've been trying to get staff and members of Congress to work on in advance of the next major violent incident, you got to get that ready in advance so that you can come out, especially if it's your group, together and be very clear. Because, you know, you're never going to prevent all violence, right? But we do know that violence happens when people feel extreme threat. So anything you can do to dial down the threat level, whether it's, you know, if you're a pundit on cable news who's scaring the you-know-what out of everyone, dial that down a little, or dial it down if you're a member of Congress or a politician, and very clearly saying that violence is never okay. Those are things that reduce political violence.
Thank you. Last question.
Okay, so you have talked about the 20%, talking to the other 20% in cases of high conflict. So how do we do that? How do we speak to the other 20%? And connected to that, are there ways to undo humiliation? So can we resolve that piece? And then what do you think the connection then is with the principles of love and forgiveness?
Is that all one question?
I smooshed three together.
Beautiful, wow. It's like, well, I'm just gonna give the microphone to whoever does that. I don't know. So a couple quick things, like I love this idea of undoing humiliation. There's a member of Congress who, I haven't asked for her permission to share this, but so I won't share her name, but she, it's actually before she was elected, there was someone on the other side of the aisle who was behaving in a way that didn't make logical sense. It seemed to be against their interest. So her side was like, well, we just have to barrel over them. We just have to, you know, they're idiots, whatever. And she was like, I just feel like there's more to this. So she asked this person to lunch. They had lunch. And soon it came out that this person had felt humiliated because she'd been overlooked and excluded from some decision that she felt she had some expertise in. So what this person did was just apologize. I'm really sorry that happened. It shouldn't have happened. And all of a sudden, they were able to get things done. So sometimes you can undo humiliation if it's not too deep, right, or public, just by apologizing to get to love and apology, right? Like even though she hadn't done that thing, she represented the group that had done it, right? As for how you speak to the 20% that's not conflict entrepreneur, I would strongly urge anyone who's dealing with a conflict entrepreneur or just curious about this to check out. I did a Q&A with Curtis Toller, the former gang leader that I mentioned, in Politico magazine, where I literally was like, look, if you take your gang violence interruption work and brought it to Capitol Hill, not saying that the parties are gangs, not saying that they're not, what would you do? Like first, second, third? And he just walked me through it. And I swear to you, it is the best blueprint I have seen. And I keep like putting it out there, hoping that one day some members of Congress or staff will try it. But what he does, so he's dealing with people who have far fewer resources on average and have experienced way more trauma than members of Congress. And still, he is asking them, relentless engagement, he calls it, relentlessly asking them, do you want to keep doing the conflict this way? And they say yes. And so then he says, because he's speaking to the 20%, how about your kids? Do you want them to have to go through this? That's usually the way in. In Colombia, same thing. The way to get guerrilla members to leave the FARC, which was the major rebel group in Colombia, the only thing that really worked other than military destruction was an ad that ran during soccer games, because they knew the FARC, the guerrilla members all listened to the soccer games on the radio. And it was really simple, and it said, son or daughter, come home, watch the next game with me. They had parents of guerrilla members inviting them home. And they saw 10 times as many defections on the days after those ads ran. In fact, more people left the FARC because of those ads than because of the peace treaty that was eventually signed in 2017. So usually family is a really good way to invite people out.
Thank you. That's a great example, actually. Very great example. I think that's all of our questions for tonight. I want to thank Amanda Ripley for an amazing lecture. Yes, please give her a hand. Thank you. Thank you so much. Yes. And I want to remind you that her books are on the back table. They are already signed. But if you want a second signature, no, I'm just, but it was really a pleasure to have you. And I think you've given us a good start to our academic year on our 30th anniversary. Thank you, Amanda. Pleasure to have you.